Hey, welcome back. Tonight on the Honda AF18 engine build, I'm going to be finishing up my oil pump block off slash mild crankcase stuffing, along with building up the bottom end of the engine and bolting most of that together. This will be broken down over 2 nights just because I have to wait for the JB weld to break, or JB weld to set up. But we'll get into this. So this is a plug that I made up. The OD is 31.1 millimeters in diameter. The ID is 22 millimeters in diameter. It's a millimeter side clearance for the shaft that goes through. It presses in lightly just into the same bore that the seal sits in. The seal can actually be pushed all the way through to the other side. And it basically pushes in and the seal now just butts right up against it. So I've done this to a few Honda cases. Push this in. Oh, sorry, it's also 704 thou tall, but you should measure your cases and make sure that you're in the right ballpark. So I push this in and then fill in all the areas around it with some JB weld. It's just like a permanent oil pump delete. Not necessarily a crankcase stuffing measure, although it does decrease crankcase volume. There is a ratio, your crankcase ratio you want to hit, but I believe it's like 1.3 or something like that. There's probably more info about that on the ESE. While I'm waiting for the JB weld to dry, I figured I would just check the crank. Since it's a used crank, I want to make sure it's straight and running true. Really all you need to do this yourself is a cheap dial indicator. I think you can get these at like Princess Auto or the American counterpart to that for, 30 or 40 bucks. And a set of these V blocks. Again, like any machining store, cheap, like 10 or 15 bucks. Having two is nice, just so you can see if one end is wobbling when the other one's not, but you can do it with one. But yeah, everything seems good. So this crank is good to go in. One thing I realized as the JB weld was drying is that I had traced out but forgot to cut out the boost port, and that's something I didn't really talk about either. So with most kits, I mean even the Honda specific ones, you often have to notch out the boost port because the boost port is bigger on the newer cylinder. So you just lay your gasket over, put some Sharpie down, take a sharp scriber and just trace it out. You may also have to blend in some of the transfer port edges and whatnot as well. It just depends on what your setup is. So this one looks like it's got to take quite a bit out of the boost port there. It's got a very small boost port. This one opens up quite a bit. So I'm just going to set up each halve on the mill and just come in with an end mill and knock some of that out of there. So that's one side. I don't really need to show you the other side. It's basically the same as this. You'll also notice I didn't continue the line all the way down. Keeping this lug here helps with windage. Keeps the crank separated from the incoming fuel charge. You'll see on like a lot of high-end race carts, they'll have almost just enough room to allow the rod to slip through and the crank is totally enclosed. That's not the case with this so much. I mean, it's a very small amount, but if you can leave it, I would. You could also do this with basic tools like files or rotary tool, burr, similar to what I was using to port. One other thing I have to talk about is the shrouding of the transfer ports by the cylinder once it's installed. I kind of skipped over this part as well. But basically it's just what it sounds like. So when you install the cylinder, it blocks off part of the transfer port on the bottom. So you always have to check this to make sure that that is unrestricted. Now you don't want to go hogging a whole bunch of material out of this. The more cylinder liner you have, the more stability the piston has in the bore. But I mean, within reason, removing some of this to open up the port a little bit more is not out of the question. So for whatever your build is, I mean, if you're going for that maximum performance, yeah, and you don't really care about piston life, you can cut a big chunk of that out of there. But I would leave as much as possible if it's a street scooter, but you definitely clean up like the sides here, so there and there, make it as wide as the port is, the beginning of the transfer ports are, sorry, and do the same thing, bolt this cylinder to the other half, and do the same thing to the other side as well. So there is one side cleaned up. So this is the side that's been touched up, and this side you can still see is all jagged and weird. That just gives you an idea of what we're after. So with the bottom of the cylinder all done, cases washed and cleaned, down in front of the heater there on the floor, we'll just start preheating them to install bearings. Sorry, the fan's still going. I'm still heating up the other half of the case there to install the bearings. If you want a more in-depth walkthrough of me building a motor, there's two videos I have. One is me building an RC1, one is me building a Minarelli engine. I cover most of the basic stuff. The same thing is going to apply here. Just going to heat up the cases and press these bearings in. I also have a case puller to pull the crank through. So you can use a torch. I prefer the heat gun. I've washed everything in the sink. Everything is cleaned, ready to go. So a little known fact, maybe you do know, maybe you don't. Peugeot bearings for any of the 2T motors fit in a Honda. The seals do not, but it opens up the doors for you to get all kinds of bearings. You can spend like $200 on like Stage6 or the Melosi race bearings with the polymer cages. These are the Polini bearings. I don't know if they're the Evolution bearings or not, I can't remember. But it gives me spare Peugeot seals for something else, and a set of bearings for the same price as it would cost to get the Honda bearings. Anyway, I'm gonna slam these bearings in and get this bottom end together. So next time we will be installing transmission, variator, shimming it out a little bit, trying to get everything where it needs to be. Probably have to knock down a few spots in the cases where the belt normally rubs. And I still need to order the intake. I'm not sure which one I'm going to use, but I do have 2 Moto Tassinari reed blocks, so I may just make those work. May get just a good old CT, good old cheap CT, and lap all the faces and make it good and bolt it on there. But that's it for tonight. Until next time, take care.